Oh, congratulations. It wasn't for the meeting. Are we live? It's like.
Yes, we are live.
Okay. Good morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee 2025. We will be kicking off our testimony this session with our attorney, Michael O'Grady, with an introduction to water quality law as a kind of a warm up for a deeper dive into the Clean Water Act of 2015, Act 64. We're going to be digging into that and looking at it in the next week or so, I hope. I'd like to take a moment, since it's our first time on Zoom, just to go around the room and introduce ourselves. John, would you start?
John Brooklyn from Heartland, also representing Windsor and West Windsor.
Christy Morris, representing Springfield and North Springfield.
Rob North, representing the Greater Virgins area from Ferrisburg.
Kate Logan, representing Burlington.
Larry Sedgwitz from Randolph, also representing Braintree, Brookfield, Granville, and Roxbury.
Amy Sheldon, representing Middlebury.
Larry Laper, representing Essex, Orleans District 1.
Ella Chapin, representing East Montpelier and Middlesex.
Mike Taglia, representing Orange 1, Corinth, Orange, Washington, and Berkshire.
Sarita Austin, representing Colchester 19.
Chris Pritchard, representing Paulette, Middletown Springs, Plymouth Wells, and Hooper.
So my name is Michael O'Grady. I am the Deputy Chief Counsel for the Legislative Council. I've been here since 2004. I fortunately or unfortunately have written almost every water quality law since then. I can give you as much of a in-depth or broad overview as you would like. Fortunately, an in-depth overview will probably take like the entire session. For a broad overview, I can probably get through in about an hour and a half. The water quality law federally and in the state it's extensive. It's technical and confusing. I have a handout that Annika has put up on the committee page that has an evolution of ag water quality requirements, just ag water requirements since 1970. It's about 6 pages long. And it's just ag water quality. You added the other water quality requirements to it, stormwater, discharge, combined sewer overflow. It would probably be closer to 20 pages. And that's how extensive this body of law can be. So today, I'm going to focus really on 2 components of water quality law. One is permitting, and one is the water quality standards, the water quality requirements under both state and federal law. I'm going to ping pong back and forth a little bit between the two. And then I'm going to end up with a pretty significant issue that you will likely, as the body, be looking at this year and how to address it through policy or not. And then I'll just end with all the things that I didn't discuss today. It's a list. So that's where I'll begin. I want this to be very conversational. As I said, it can be technical, difficult, or confusing. If you don't understand something, please ask, because I think that'll make this go faster and smoother. All set? Okay. So let's start with the Federal Clean Water Act. It's really not the name of it. It was passed in 1972 as an amendment to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which was something that existed since the early 50s, but it wasn't working because rivers literally were catching on fire. And so something needed to be done. And during the early 70s, during President Nixon's term, in fact, there was a suite of environmental laws that were passed in the Clean Water Act was one of them. The aim of the Clean Water Act is to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution to the nation's water in order to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. It achieves that purpose in multiple ways, through water quality requirements on states, through permitting requirements, through wetlands regulations, through funding to states. And the states do get significant funding under the Clean Water Act and other requirements. So what I'm gonna, as I said earlier, gonna focus on permitting and water quality standards. So the first thing you need to realize about the Clean Water Act is and its permitting requirement, it has a broad prohibition. And that broad prohibition is a discharge of pollutants to a navigable water is prohibited unless the discharger has a permit from US EPA or a delegated state. So there's a couple of terms in there that are kind of, they're very important, very significant. What is a discharge of pollutants? It's the addition of any pollutant. Let's stop there. A pollutant is pretty much anything you put in the water. It is dirt, it is sediment, it is chemicals, it is heat. If you draw water in to cool your turbines and then discharge it out into that water, and the water is hotter than it was when you drew it in, that's a pollutant. So anything that you do or add to the water is effectively a pollutant. And when you put that into the water, you need a permit for that. But what water do you have to get a permit for? Is it every water? The Act says navigable water. And then it defines navigable water as a water of the United States. So not really helpful, right? Not exactly detailed about what type of water the discharge is to. Well, EPA tried to define that in their rule. And they basically said 4 categories. So there's more than 4 categories, but these are the main 4 categories. The first is waters which have traditionally been used for commerce and which you can move commerce on, because this is an interstate jurisdiction. EPA has jurisdiction over waters when they have interstate effect or consequences. So moving commerce on waters, that's an interstate. It also is the tributaries of those interstate waters, and it's also those waters that significantly affect the tributaries. Well, that's what it used to be. It used to be significantly affect. It also used to be those wetlands that significantly affected the surface waters, those navigable waters and their tributaries. Significantly affect. Well, what did significantly affect? What did it used to mean? It used to mean that there was a material influence on the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of the water. That non-navigable, non-tributary, non-significant wetland had a significant effect on the water because of its functions. Like it had flood control. It moderated flow. It was something where there was transport of aquatic vertebrae or aquatic animal wildlife through it. That was significantly affect. Well, there were a lot of people that didn't like that because they thought that that created a more expansive jurisdiction for US EPA than they thought was appropriate. And they sued. They sued the EPA in a decision called Sackett versus EPA. The US Supreme Court said, yes, that's too expansive. The court said that the Clean Water Act's jurisdiction only applies to wetlands with a continuous surface connection to bodies that are waters of the United States in their own right, and so that they are indistinguishable from those traditional waters. So it's no longer about whether or not a wetland significantly affects a tributary. It has to be connected to it. And the example I like to give here when you drive down 89 and you're like driving through Middlesex and there's that little farm on the side of the road and there's a cornfield there and they grow pumpkins and they sell them in the fall. And the Winooski's like out there, just right over there. But there's this little pothole in the middle of that field. It's a little wetland pothole. It is probably connected to the Winooski, but underground. That used to be a water that you couldn't discharge into. It used to be a wetland that significantly affected a traditional navigable water. It isn't anymore. It's not a surface connected wetland. So that is no longer subject to the federal jurisdiction
Excuse me for a moment, but that's since 2023.
since 2020.
And so our law passed before that. I assume you'll connect that for us.
Yes.
Point that out that this was 2023.
I'm getting to this is like the ping pong. So does that mean like there's like discharge parties or people are like, yeah, I can go out and like put whatever I want into the wetland now? And like, no, that's not really the status of at the federal level, because there's this other case out there by the Supreme Court. It's County of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund, where there in that situation, there was this discharge that they were discharging just to injection wells, and basically injection wells, you just discharge into a hole in the ground. And that was migrating to the Pacific Ocean. And the discharger was saying, hey, we didn't put it into the ocean. It just got there eventually. And the environmental advocates were saying, no, it's going into a water of the United States. You need a permit for that. And the court said, yes, an actual discharge to a water of the United States or a functional equivalent is going to require a permit. Now think back to that little pothole over there. It's not surface connected, so it's not going to be regulated as a wetland. But if you have a discharge party there and you put a ton of stuff in there and it winds up in the Winooski, well, that would have needed a permit, because that would have been the functional equivalent of a discharge. So you're in this weird status at the federal level, like they don't have jurisdiction if it's not surface connected, unless I actually somehow put that pollutant into one of those traditional. It's weird, and this is kind of so representative of clean water law. There's these decisions that are made, and nobody knows what they mean. And then we have to figure it out, and EPA has to adopt a rule, and that rule gets litigated, and that rule gets amended. That's where we are right now with like, what is a water of the United States and what do you need a permit for its functional equivalent? So you say to yourself, well, Vermont must be pretty confusing to get a permit in right now. And the answer to that is no, because Vermont is largely significantly unaffected. The federal law is a floor. The federal law is just the minimum that a state needs to meet. The state can build on top of that. And Vermont, like most states, has its own water quality laws that are additional to or different from the federal requirements. And that's really, really highlighted when you look at what is prohibited in Vermont and what requires permit in Vermont for a discharge. It says no person shall discharge any waste, substance, or material into waters of the United States. It doesn't say pollutant, it says waste. And it says into the waters of the state, so not navigable waters, not waters of the United States, waters of the state, without first obtaining a permit for that discharge from the secretary. It's broader. And you know how much broader it is? Because waters are defined as all rivers, streams, creeks, brooks, reservoirs, ponds, lakes, springs, and all bodies of surface waters, artificial or natural, that are contained within, flow through, or border upon the state or any portion of it. That's pretty much everything. So in Vermont, if you're going to put a waste into any water, you probably should talk to A&R about whether or not you need a permit or coverage under what's called a general permit.
Representative Bartholomew.
Does that then include, you mentioned warm water, would that be a waste under this definition?
Yes, yes. And in fact, the heat. I was looking for Catherine Guessing. So back when Vermont Yankee was operating, they were drawing in water from the Connecticut, using it to cool turbines and then discharging it. And there was a question about whether or not the heat in it was a waste, was a pollutant, and whether or not the level of heat wasn't just the heat, it's just like how hot did it have to be? And so that was all litigated, and Catherine litigated that like 15 years ago, maybe even longer. So yes, in Vermont, heat is a waste. But even though there's Vermont specific permitting, and here are some of the examples of Vermont specific permitting, there's state stormwater operating permits just for construction of a certain amount of impervious surface. There's state permitting for significant wetlands, and wetlands in Vermont is not defined by whether or not they're connected to navigable water. They're defined by whether or not they are significant and they provide the functions that wetlands do in a way that is significant. There's also state stream alteration permits. If you're going to take a certain amount of sediment, of debris out of a water in this state, out of a river, you're going to need a permit. That's not required under the Federal Clean Water Act. Maybe. There's something called lake shoreline permits for how you develop or what impervious surface you put in next to a lake in Vermont. That's not required by the feds. And then there's state large and medium farm permitting, which is not required by the feds. But we'll talk about why the feds actually led to that program.
Representative Chapin.
I was just wondering, like, if you have handouts underneath your slides.
I do have the PowerPoint, and I brought the PowerPoint as a print just in case it failed. So if anybody wants a paper copy.
All right, and does anyone who wants to follow on their device need help finding this presentation on our webpage? That's what I do. I follow along.
Aren't you there? So even though the federal permitting is a floor, even though Vermont has adopted state-specific permitting and has gone above and beyond the federal floor, you still have to take into account what the federal permitting requirements are. Remember, we talked about the general prohibition. No person can discharge a pollutant into navigable water without a permit. That's the general prohibition under the Clean Water Act. But then they have specific permits for specific types of discharges. They have a specific permit requirement for concentrated animal feeding operation. They have a specific permit requirement for industrial wastewater, municipal wastewater, for certain types of stormwater. So runoff from construction sites, urban development, what is called the MS4 permit, and industrial sites, which is called the multi-sector general permit.
Yeah, Representative Pritchard.
Yeah, what defines a significant wetland?
So in Vermont, there's a rule. Well, actually, it starts out with a statute 10 VSA 902 or something like that, which lists all the functions of a wetland that the agency needs to look at to determine whether or not they are providing a significant benefit through preservation as a wetland. So the agency or consultants go out and they do a review and they look at that and they make that determination. Before I go further, these discharge permits relate to point sources. So when you are discharging from a point source is when you need that permit. And it's a really kind of intriguing definition because a point source is any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance, including but not limited to any pipe, ditch, channel, conduit, well, discrete fissure, container, rolling stock, concentrated animal feeding operation. Concentrated animal feeding operation is where animals are held, fed or held over the course for 45 days or more over the course of a 12-month period. It's a farm. A concentrated animal feeding operation is a farm. So a farm is the same thing as a pipe. So obviously you can't really regulate the stuff that comes out of the pipe the same way that you regulate the farm. So and that's something we're going to talk about because it's something you're going to have to look at, likely, maybe if the chair so wants this session.
Representative North.
Point of clarification, are we talking about the requirements of Vermont law or the national pollution discharge?
Well, that's the thing. It's a great question because it leads right to the next slide. So EPA generally has what's called override authority over enforcement of the Federal Clean Water Act, but they delegate the permitting requirements to states. So in 1974, EPA delegated that permitting requirements for CAFOs and all the other permits to Vermont. So Vermont technically is the one that is issuing this permit under Vermont law, but EPA has some overriding enforcement authority, which I'm going to talk about, if you don't mind, in a couple of minutes. So that means that the CAFO permit, the discharge permit, the stormwater permit, the construction general permit, the MS4, the multi-sector, they're all state permits, but are required by federal law. So now we're ping-ponging. We're ping-ponging away from permitting and we're ping-ponging to water quality. As I said at the beginning, the Clean Water Act multi-function, one of those significant main aspects is it requires states to adopt water quality standards. And those standards must ensure full support of the designated uses of the water. And in Vermont, the designated uses are behind me: public water supply, aesthetics, fishing, irrigation, etc. And any use of a water must maintain those uses. There's something called the anti-degradation policy, which means when you use a water, you can't degrade that water so it's worse than it was before you started to use it. You can't degrade it so that a use in that water is no longer viable. So when you're approving a use, the state is approving a use, and needs to make sure that any of these designated uses are maintained and are not what is called impaired, and we'll get to that in a minute. You're probably going to hear from some people about changing these designated uses. You might hear about adding certain uses to these. You can add uses to the designated uses, but it often creates confusion and it often creates tension between the various uses. So just highlighting that's something that you might hear about. So how does the state know that the water quality standards are being met? How does the state even know what condition the waters of the state are in? Well, the Clean Water Act requires the state to go out and report every 2 years to EPA on the status of its water. And the state does that, and it does a pretty good job of doing that. And you'll see some numbers on the screen on the slide about how much rivers and streams there are, how many ponds there are, how many acres there are. The important number is that 4,300 miles of the waters of the state out of the 5,800 are fully supporting all designated uses. So 75% of the river miles in the state are supporting the uses. That's actually a pretty good number. You think that's like a C? That's like on the curve across America, that's like kind of B plus, maybe even more.
70s? What curve? Come on. It's not Vermont. We're better than that. Right.
And so that's something to keep in mind. And the water quality assessments are readily available online. I gave there's a link to it there if you want to go check it out yourself. But in addition to that water quality assessment report, the Federal Clean Water Act requires states to go out every 3 years to review every one of their waters and determine whether that specific water is meeting the water quality standards. If the water is not meeting the state water quality standards, it's designated as impaired. And the state must develop a cleanup plan for that water. Well, what does impaired mean? Remember those designated uses? So if the use of this of the water or something else in the water is affecting those designated uses so that they cannot be conducted, that is an impairment. When you have an impairment, you need a plan. And that plan is called the total maximum daily load, TMDL. And so the state, when it goes out every 3 years to review the waters to determine whether they are impaired, they have to do a list. It's required under the Clean Water Act. They have to list all of their impaired waters. It's called the 303D list. Well, the 303D list is only those waters that are impaired and need a TMDL. There's also a list of waters that are impaired and have a TMDL. There's also a list of waters that are stressed, not like anxious, but like they are on the verge of needing a TMDL, or are they on the verge of not supporting a designated use. And then there's a list of waters that basically aquatic nuisance are affecting those waters. So there's multiple waters in the state that are subject to some pressure. Even though 75% of the waters in the state meet designated uses, there are still a lot of waters that are dealing with some sort of impairment or stress or aquatic nuisance. And they're everywhere. It's not just Champlain. It's not just for Magog. Every watershed, every basin in this state has an impaired water in it. Back during the Act 64 time, there was a representative that was like, oh, the Battenkill is pristine. I can drink the Battenkill without going through it. And I'm like, I won't do that, because there's parts of the Battenkill that are stressed and or potentially impaired today. It's like, so every basin in this state has an impaired water in it.
Representative Pritchard.
Yeah. Where do you find the causes or see these impairments and know what they are? You know, we have Medowee, that's in my district. That river actually flows into New York.
Right. And so the cause of impairments is the screen behind me. When you look at the 303D list or the other list, it will tell you what the impairment is. It will tell you and what is causing the impairment. So, for example, use what are called the stormwater impaired waters in Vermont. The stormwater impaired waters, they're impaired because of flow, because of the precipitation events, the melting, etc. It is scouring those rivers, those waters, and adding sediment to those waters that prevent it from meeting the aquatic biota, the aquatic wildlife requirements, the designated use of those waters, because it's too turbid. Aquatic biota can't use those waters anymore. There are no fish in those waters because it's too turbid. And so that was the cause, was the flow, because the waters weren't being managed in a way, or effectively development around those waters wasn't managed in the appropriate way to reduce the flow. And so it got impaired because it is not supporting the aquatic biota in those waters. Look at Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain, the impairment is that it creates aquatic blooms. And those aquatic blooms, algae blooms, they prevent the use of the water for recreation. They prevent the use of the water by aquatic biota. And they have they can have effects on public water supply, et cetera. So it affects those designated uses. The cause is runoff. And it's runoff from municipal development, it's runoff from farms. It's that runoff that's adding phosphorus to the water. I'm debating with myself. So we're going to talk about all the things that you do under a TMDL and what a TMDL is intended to do and the plan that you need to do to implement TMDL. TMDLs are about controlling the loads, controlling about what's coming off or going into a water now. Most of these waters already have what are called legacy load. There is phosphorus or PCBs or other contaminants already in the water, and they have been there for a long time. And those legacy contaminants can get disturbed and then enter the water column again. What does that mean? Like, you can control the existing loading, but you also have legacy load. Unfortunately, that usually means that to clean up the water is going to take longer than expected. When there's legacy load, it's hard to predict. You might control everything that's coming off. There might be zero new going into a water, but because of the legacy load, the water still is generating algae blooms. It's still restricting one of the designated uses. You know, when I first started, the governor at that time said Lake Champlain was going to be cleaned up in 6 years. Everybody's like, yay! And now it's like maybe 100 years. And because we just understand the science better. Should I go on?
Yeah. I guess that would apply to anything. I mean, the Meadowy Valley, when I was a kid, we had tons of farms. We had 2 left. That's all. So that's it. So, that's the state of Vermont. That was their identity. We're all farmers. So this legacy thing affects the whole.
Yeah, and the legacy thing is even a little bit more like, it's a little more curious. It's because for a long time, the federal government was just shipping in phosphorus as a soil amendment and giving it away effectively, because the science at that time was like, this is the thing that really will help with your crops. And everybody wanted to grow more crops. So
I hate to do this, but I already asked some other people to leave, and trying to maintain our 17 people in the room, and asking folks that, yeah, you could go out and listen, and thank you. Sorry to do that, but we're trying to stay healthy. Limited airing.
So you have an impairment, A&R goes out, they look at the water, they add your water to the 303D list, they say you need a TMDL. Well, what is that?
Representative Bartholomew had his hand up. I got distracted.
Keep referring back to the designated uses. I'm curious, aquatic biota and aquatic habitat seem really very closely connected. What's the difference?
It's, the biota is the actual organism. And the habitat is what they use for it. Here's a good example. So, small hydro, 5 megawatts or less. So it probably won't impair the aquatic biota because it's small enough that it doesn't impede their movement. It doesn't, or just a turbine. It's not going to really affect that biota itself, but it's going to affect the habitat. It might reduce the flow or require a higher flow at certain times of year that will impact the ability of that biota to use that stretch of water, that segment as habitat.
So does the biota then refer to species diversity and numbers?
That's a good question. I think I need to look into that a little bit further.
We'll have folks from A&R who can answer that question next week, but generally, yes, it does.
What is a TMDL? A TMDL is a target. I think of it like a budget. It's like what you want to spend in your household every month. It's what you want to add to the water annually that will still maintain that water at the water quality standard. And so when you do that, just like you do your budget, you add up what you're going to need to spend, what you're going to have to add to the lake from your different sources. So there's the point sources that are adding to a water. There's the non-point sources. And when you use non-point sources, because you can't predict the rain, as we've all learned over the past couple of years, you have to build in a margin of safety to your TMDL to basically account for those unpredictables. So you have the maximum amount of point source, maximum amount of non-point source, and the margin of safety that the water can handle and still meet water quality standards. And that's your plan. That's your goal. That's where you're going, your budget. That's what you want to meet in order to get that water unimpaired. Well, how do you do that? You get to your budget. There's multiple ways to do that. There's actions necessary that you could, or actions that you could take to reduce the load from point sources or from non-point sources. And when you apply these factors, these restrictions, they generally apply across the watershed, the entire watershed. So in Champlain, it's here in Montpelier because the Winooski runs into the Champlain. It's in Memphremagog, it's the large part of the Northeast Kingdom because it runs into Memphremagog. Ultimately, it will be for the large part of the east part of the state because most of that runs into Connecticut, and the Connecticut has a TMDL for Long Island Sound that will ultimately get to Vermont. I don't know when, because I've been saying it's ultimately going to get to Vermont for 20 years. And so it'll ultimately get here, but I don't know. So how do you meet your budget? How do you get to this plan, this target for having a water that has loading? So you're not saying no more loading ever, because that's just not really reasonable. How do you get to that? Well, you have to come up with a plan. The Clean Water Act requires a state, when they identify an impaired water, to come up with their target and then to come up with a plan for it. Except for Lake Champlain. Because Lake Champlain first had a TMDL in 2002, 2004, I can't remember. First one. But then there was a petition from an environmental advocacy group to EPA, and I'll talk about petitions in a minute. They said, no, the 2002 TMDL wasn't meeting the federal requirements for the Clean Water Act, and that a new TMDL needed to be issued. And EPA agreed with that, and they disapproved the 2002 TMDL. But what happens when EPA disapproves a state's TMDL is EPA is required to issue the TMDL. EPA is required to take on that responsibility and be the one that comes up with the budget and theoretically comes up with the plan for how to meet that budget. So when EPA disapproved the Lake Champlain TMDL, it was on them. And they were supposed to do that within 90 days.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, when you say come up with a budget, does that mean the funding for the budget or
No.
just come up with the budget?
Just come up with that goal
The pollutant budget.
of the
Gotcha.
pollutant budget. They were supposed to do that within 90 days. 3 years later, we still didn't have a TMDL, and that was actually probably a good thing. Because when you look at the alternatives that EPA had, they only had that permitting authority I talked about earlier. They could only impose or get to that target, get to the loading budget by implementing their permitting requirements. They could only impose stricter requirements on farms. They could only impose stricter requirements on municipal. They could only impose stricter requirements on construction or industrial. And they probably wouldn't have gotten to the target, and it probably would have cost a lot of money, and it probably we would have been doing this again. So what the state did is the state realized that EPA's authority wasn't going to get to the target. And the state ANR, the Agency of Ag, stepped up and said, listen, remember, we can do more than you can because we can adopt things that you don't. And we're going to commit to meeting the budget through our Vermont's laws and requirements. And that's what you did. So you used all of EPA's authority, and then you added to that. You added programs for stormwater control. You added agricultural controls. You added transportation controls. And it was cost effective. You weren't requiring every wastewater treatment plant in the Champlain Basin to do 50 million upgrades, you know? So, but I can skip ahead. And so this shows some of the things that you did. You had agricultural programs, you had forest management programs, wetland protection. But some of these things that you committed to in the negotiation with EPA, you didn't actually have the authority, or EPA or ANR and Ag. These programs didn't exist. They were just theoretical. So what had to happen was Act 64 of 2015. The agencies came to you and said, hey, in order for us to have the TMDL approved, we have to have this implementation plan. We need this authority. We need these programs. We need these permitting requirements. Will you please do that? And that's what you did in Act 64. But you needed the money to do all of those programs, because all of those state programs, whether they're federally required or something that you came up with on your own as the legislature, they require money. And EPA also, when they approved the TMDL, they approved something that was relatively innovative for TMDLs. It was called the Accountability Framework. It was basically a report card. It was basically the things you needed to do in order to get an approval from EPA over time. And there were like 28 to 30 things that were listed. And ultimately, one of the last things that the state needed to do was to come up with a dedicated funding source that would support all of the different programs that were enacted to do the implementation plan for Lake Champlain. And that funding source is basically recognized, or all of the funding sources are recognized under what's called the Vermont Clean Water Fund. And this is where all the different revenue sources for clean water are deposited. Let's talk about, there's a 0.22% surcharge on most property transfer tax assessments. There's all of the unclaimed beverage container deposits. Does everybody know what that means? When you don't take back your can, the manufacturer keeps the 5 cent. For decades, the manufacturer just kept the 5 cents and that was it. A few years ago, you said, no, the manufacturer has to give those 5 cents back to the state because it's what's called in a sheet. Not really the manufacturer's property. They were just holding it for the consumer. And the state took those back. Then 6% of the revenues from the meals and rooms taxes goes into the Clean Water Fund. And then there's other revenue that goes into it, whether it's federal or not. So that's what the Clean Water Fund is. That's the dedicated funding source that EPA required for the Lake Champlain TMDL. And so this is the recommended expenditures. This isn't the record. This is what's in the Clean Water Fund this year. There's 28 million from those sources I just listed. There's 10 million from the capital bill. There's 7.5 times funds from unallocated unreserved clean water funds and projected interest. So there's a significant amount of money in the fund, 46 million. And the fund doesn't work like you might think a fund works. It's not that the Agency of Ag or the Agency of Natural Resources just issues grants from this fund. The Clean Water Board is the entity that administers the fund, and they are required annually to report to the governor, and then the governor reports in the budget to you a recommended use of what's in the Clean Water Fund. And then the General Assembly votes to appropriate the multiple revenues from the fund to different activities. And Ted from JFO does a good breakdown of the fund, how much from the different sources. He's got his own PowerPoint that he can walk you through this. And then the agencies are required to report to you about how the money from the Clean Water Fund is spent and how basically the Clean Water Initiative is performing. They've combined those reporting requirements into one report called the Clean Water Initiative Performance Report. And it will show you how investments are being used and what sectors they're being used. It'll show you how effective the TMDL has been, including like what sources of reduction are. Example, like the yellow there is agricultural pollutant load reduction. And so you'll see what's attributed, what load reduction is attributed, what sector. You see over here what sector gets sources. And it goes into a lot more detail than this. These are just two graphics from a larger work.
Michael, we've been going for like 50 minutes. I just want to check in. I think we could take a 5-minute break.
Sure.
Great. So let's do that. We can pause the online. And we'll come back and live it up 10 minutes.
10 minutes, 5 minutes.
See you.